Hello, welcome to Sullivan and Cromwell's Wind of Change webinar. We hope everybody is safe and well in these extraordinary times. My name is Chris Mann. I'm a partner in Sullivan and Cromwell's Project and Finance Group. I coordinate our infrastructure practice. And we're looking forward to a discussion today about the development of the offshore wind market, both offshore Europe and the United States primarily. I'm joined today by a number of my colleagues who've been active in this space. First, in New York, my partner Inosi Nyata, who's co-head of our global project development and finance group, who has spent a lot of time in this space. Our special counsel, Tia Barancic, who's co-head of our power and utility group. Turning to London, two other colleagues, my partner Craig Jones, who's a senior member of our development and project finance practice, who has a very long history in wind projects. In fact, the first one he worked on was, he advised on Greece's first privately developed wind farm in 1997. Sam Saunders, a senior associate in our London office, has extensive renewables and energy expertise and a background in civil and environmental engineering, and has led our firm's efforts in many ways on the development of sustainable initiatives. This webinar is going to focus on the financing options for offshore wind projects, focusing first in Europe, which obviously is much further on than the United States in development. And we'll look at both financing and structuring issues after that to look at how debt, equity, and particularly in the case of the United States, tax equity work together to help develop a project and to finance a project. So first, before we start, a couple of program notes. First, on the Q&A, the Q&A function has been enabled, so feel free to use it, send any questions you have during the webinar. Hopefully we'll have time at the end to address some of those, but the good news is that we will be sending the responses to questions that we don't have time to address. We'll get those back to people who ask us questions. Second, a word on the slides you're seeing now. You're only going to see a few slides, so when your slides, finish in a couple of minutes, it's not because the slide presentation has failed. You're just going to see a few slides from time to time, mainly at the beginning and then at the end. The other good news is that there will be a full slide deck with much more detailed slides that will not necessarily be a summary of what we said, but we'll have further information for you that we will send to all the participants later. And since I've started talking, I know a lot more people have joined us, so I'll just summarize. You see here my colleagues both in London and New York, and you have here some of the key members of our renewables team, both in Europe and the UK and the US. So let's just talk for a minute to set the scene here. Many of you have joined from Europe, others from the US. There are a large number of people here, so with a wide variety of experiences. So I just want to take a step back for a minute. If you think about the energy market in Europe, it's interesting to think about the North Sea, because if you go back to the 1960s, when massive oil and gas resources were developed in the North Sea, that really drove the energy market in the UK and Europe for really 30 years before production issues began to cause that energy production to taper off. Then you had the beginning of the development of the offshore wind market around 1990 in Europe, really coinciding with that if you think about it. Particularly offshore Denmark in the case of the first offshore wind farm, and then a decade later, the first large-scale offshore wind turbine farm was offshore Denmark with 22 megawatt turbines. So the market really began to develop that long ago. Europe is that far in advance of the United States, say at least 25 years, or call it roughly 25 years. Just to give you some facts for those of you not sitting in Europe, but who want to just get an understanding of how the European market has developed. In 2009, the EU enacted the Renewable Energy Directive and committed to obtaining 20% of its energy from renewable sources by last year. The excitement then began to grow around that time with regard to large-scale developments. In 2016, the Paris Climate Accord was signed. Obviously, the Biden administration has announced rejoining that, and that committed more than 70 countries to an energy transformation and highlighted wind energy and national climate plans. Just 2 years ago then, in 2019, the EU recast the electricity directive to complete the internal electricity market and open the market to renewables. And then the EU, same year, EU launched the Green Deal with the goal of making Europe climate neutral in 30 years by 2050. In November 2020, in the midst of COVID, a dedicated EU strategy for offshore renewable energy, including offshore wind, was published. And that called for at least 60 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. The other thing that's been happening during this time period is turbine technology has progressed very substantially from early offshore projects with projects currently in development offshore Europe, planning to use turbines as powerful as 14 megawatts. Just to give you a snapshot of today, total European and UK combined offshore wind capacity is now approximately 24 gigawatts, and the offshore wind project pipeline is over 100 gigawatts. This year, more than 15 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity is expected to be auctioned in Europe, with the UK alone expected to award contracts for difference for about 12 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. I want to just give you one more fact that's of interest in terms of a comparison. The coastline of the UK, if you include the islands, the Outer Hebrides, et cetera, is about 32,000 kilometers. Europe has a coastline of about 66,000 kilometers if you include all of Europe. By contrast, the US coastline is 20,000 kilometers. So a lot of land mass, less offshore, less coastline. But let's now turn to the US. What I said about Europe is going to actually be a precursor to what we've seen in the US. If you think of the US energy market over the last, say, 15 years, as everybody on this call knows, it's been a story of the rise of large-scale productive capacity of hydrocarbons in the US, both in terms of oil and natural gas, in part due to fracking. And now the US has become one of the largest exporters of natural gas and oil in the hemisphere, and one of the most important producers in the world, which has geopolitical implications. With the availability of wide-scale productive capacity that's relatively inexpensive, together with the absence of very significant federal legislation apart from tax incentives to develop renewables energy, the US has been slow to develop that. And so as a result, as I said, it's about 25 years behind Europe. The legislative and regulatory picture is a little more complicated than that, though, because the US is, of course, a federal system with 50 states, and there are state incentives for the development of renewables portfolios. And so there has been important progress in the offshore wind area and renewables generally in terms of tax and other incentives, and we'll be talking quite a bit about that today. The other piece to this, of course, the backdrop for all of this, we don't have any answers for you today, but really in the US, all eyes are going to be focused on the Biden administration. We now have not only a House, but a Senate that will be controlled by the Democrats, although by a slim margin, with both Georgia Senate seats being won by the Democratic Party. And as everyone knows now, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, elect, I should say, will cast the deciding vote on split legislation in the Senate. There will still be times, obviously, that is not going to be filibuster proof. So, but in general, the Democratic Party will have substantial leeway to develop its environmental and its energy policy. So all eyes are on that. And we'll talk just a touch about that today. So just, this kind of the same snapshot of the U.S., if you will, just to give you that before we get into the discussion. There are not yet any large-scale offshore wind projects operating in the U.S. There are two, large-scale wind projects. There are two offshore wind projects operating in the U.S. One is Block Island, the other is Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind. Block Island is the first operational wind farm in the U.S. That's a 30 megawatt project off the coast of Block Island, which is Rhode Island. The success of that project created significant optimism for offshore wind development in the U.S., especially off the coast of New England. Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind is Dominion Energy's 12 megawatt test project off Virginia, which finished construction just last year. In development now is another significant project, which is Vineyard Wind, which is a proposed 800 megawatt project off the coast of Massachusetts, being developed by Iberdrola through Avangrid Resources and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, or CIP. That project has faced some challenges, as you may have read. The project has faced repeated delays in obtaining approval of its environmental impact study, which was required to be supplemented, interestingly, to assess the cumulative impact of offshore wind development on the East Coast of the U.S. The supplemental EIS found positive impacts, but also mentioned some negative impacts on fisheries and shipping lanes. Obviously, although renewables are regarded as more environmental friendly than hydrocarbons, as everyone knows, there are significant environmental challenges, and the Vineyard Wind project has been subject to some of those. But the supplemental EIS assumes 22 gigawatts of capacity in Atlantic waters. So that gives some comfort that further cumulative analyses will not be required until approvals are required beyond this capacity level. So that's some good news. There are projects in development in the mid-Atlantic. New York and New Jersey have more than 5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, substantially in development. Virginia is developing the only utility-owned offshore wind project in the U.S. That's Coastal Virginia, up to about 2.5 gigawatts. The West Coast of the United States is as if I can generalize, subject to greater environmental challenges from a regulatory point of view. West Coast states are beginning to explore offshore wind projects. No federal leases have been secured yet there. California, Oregon, and Hawaii have projects under exploration. That will most likely be floating technology, which is an interesting development due to ocean depths. And there's even one Great Lakes project in development, which is 21 megawatts in Lake Erie. So that's a snapshot of the U.S. I've just ignored rest of world, with apologies to those of you who are focused on that area, But offshore wind is growing outside the two areas that we plan to focus on today. And just to give you again a kind of a tick list of countries, that would include China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, South Africa, and Brazil. China, of course, is interesting because a lot of procurement of turbines and other equipment will come from China. They are a leader in that space, just as they were in solar. So that, I hope, has given you a little bit of a snapshot. If you have focused on Europe, it gave you a view of what's happening in the US and vice versa. And now let's get into the discussion. And very grateful for my colleagues to have brought to bear their expertise on this. And we're really happy to be bringing this to you today. And we'll try to make it interesting and hopefully teach about some areas that you may not have been familiar with, and we're eager to hear from you too, based on your experiences and your expertise, so that we can share that either in the Q&A or afterwards with the group. So with that intro, let's turn to financing matters, and starting with a look at financing sources. And let's look first in Europe, since that's more developed. And for that, I turn to Craig Jones, my partner sitting in London. Craig, could you briefly describe the main sources for debt financing that have been used in Europe?
Yeah, sure, Chris. The first point to make is that we have a fairly good sample size of European projects, with about 30 major financings and 20 refinancings to date. And the majority of these financings have been project financings rather than corporate financings. And this reflects the size of the projects and the limited number of developers who could or would want to finance them on balance sheet. Debt from commercial banks has been the main source and readily available. And as the market has matured, the debt equity ratio that we've seen has steadily increased. If we look back sort of 10 years ago, it was typically around 50-50. Today, it can be 80-20 or higher. Then, in addition to commercial banks, ECAs and other IFIs have been very active in the European market. I should mention EIB in particular. It has a very strong mandate to support offshore wind and has played a large role, particularly in first-in-market deals. And the most recent example of that has been the first French project financing signed last year, where EIB agreed to lend, I think, 450 million euros for the development of approximately 500 megawatt wind project off the coast of Fécamp. Looking at the ECAs themselves, you regularly see the Scandinavian trio, Hermes out of Germany, BPI France. Those ECAs have generally provided tied or procurement-related financing. But we've also seen untied financing, and I'd mention JBIC in relation to that in particular. So if you look across the offshore and the onshore market, there are probably around about 70 institutions active in the market. So there's quite strong competition, and this has been one of the factors which has driven margins down. Again, if we look 10 years ago, typically average margins were around about 350 basis points over LIBOR. Today, that figure is probably closer to 150 basis points. And then looking outside bank and ECA markets, we have seen private placement debt with insurers and pension funds. That's generally fixed rate or linked to CPI. And then public debt is also increasingly available. We haven't yet seen a true greenfield project bond, but there have been several investment grade rated brownfield bond issuances for single assets in the Reg S 144A market. And of course, supplier financing will continue to be important. So in summary, it's really a large amount of commercial debt, a significant ECA piece, and a small but growing public debt piece too.
Thank you, Craig. At the risk of letting people see how the sausage is made, I would ask you to belt it out a little bit more when you're next speaking. I've turned my my volume up, but you were a little weak, a little more faint there than you were in the test. So still could hear you, but it's fine. Other people might have similar challenges. So Inosi, let's turn to you. That's a good summary Craig just gave us of a pretty wide range of sources of finance in offshore European projects. Do you see, and obviously, again, all of this is at a relatively nascent stage in the U.S. You see our map there. What I would ask Inosi is how you see the U.S. offshore wind financing market developing, given that range of resources, of sources of project finance and other finance in Europe. You think it'll develop in the same way in the U.S., or are there unique aspects to the U.S. that we'll see emerge?
Thanks, Chris. We think there will be some key similarities with Europe in a number of respects, such as sources of financing, the leverage levels, and others that we can talk about. However, we also see some similarities to US projects, not so much onshore wind. We expect that there will be more similarities with other large-scale US projects, principally the large US LNG export projects that we have been involved in the last decade. The reason for this is the significant amounts of capital that are required for the onshore wind projects. You just mentioned Vineyard Wind, that was reportedly seeking $2 billion of debt for their 800 megawatt project. Equinor, with their approximately 800 megawatt project, just phase one at Empire Wind, is also seeking approximately $3 billion. And then we have the whole pipeline that you mentioned. You know, Beacon Wind is 2,400 megawatts, Liberty Wind 1,200 megawatts. So these will require billions of dollars of financing for each project. And so their scale will likely lend to looking at other large-scale projects in the U.S. as precedent.
Thanks, Inosi. Can I just, more sausage making, am I the only one that's lost the map, the U.S. map, Sam? My colleagues see it? Okay, Sam, if you could, we've lost the U.S. map, if you could put it up. So, Inosi, let me just ask you, in each project, how much debt capacity is going to be available? Obviously, different sectors in terms of greenfield development financing have different expectations of debt equity ratios. But what sort of leverage levels do you think we're going to be talking about for offshore wind in the U.S.?
As Craig mentioned, in Europe, we think leverage levels will be relatively robust, right? Europe has grown over time to 70 to 80% of leverage. We think that's what we're going to see in the U.S. from the start. Vineyard Wind's expected financing was at about that level for construction debt, similar to Block Island. Now, a portion of this eventually gets taken out with tax equity as we get closer to commercial operations date. But initially, we think there will be a very big chunk of that capital that comes from debt sources. Again, this is similar to what we saw with large-scale US LNG projects. You know, these are seen like infrastructure, like long-term stable cash flow streams that support the significant amount of leverage. This is sort of supported by the current environment. We have low interest rates that are expected to support large debt incurrence for projects like these. And very many of these developers may have capital constraints, not necessarily just based on the market environment, but also because of the fact that a number of them are involved in several of these projects, and so will require significant capital to deploy across their projects. As Craig mentioned, in Europe, project finance is likely to be a key structure that's used in the US because despite the sponsors having strong balance sheets, they are involved in a number of projects. Project financing allows them to have this debt put in place for the particular project, and so it's likely to be a significant source and structure used for these financings.
So let me just try. I want to make a point here about the way Sullivan and Cromwell runs its practice. We tend to be generalists, and one aspect of that is that when we're talking about financing, that we don't really have specialists for ECA financing, acquisition financing, leverage financing, project financing, and Inosi and Craig, whose core practice area is finance, are very focused across the entire suite of the capital stack. And so getting your view, Inosi, is interesting, right? Because you see across the whole range of, because you're a key member of the leverage finance practice and acquisition finance, the types of financing sources that are available in that market, in project financing, and you know, other structured financing. So turning to that, where do you see the sources of finance? Craig had a whole suite that we've seen in Europe, and obviously those have been brought to bear in other projects from time to time in the US, but what about offshore wind?
Chris, that's a great question. So going back again to the point about needing a lot of capital and a lot of leverage, we expect that multiple sources of finance will be used for a single project. However, as we saw with large US LNG projects, we expect a big chunk of that debt, particularly at the construction stage, will be commercial bank debt. Right? Commercial banks are likely to have a very strong appetite for offshore wind, not just because offshore wind will likely be the largest sector requiring project financing in the next few years, but also because of the drumbeat supporting green and ESG-friendly investments. We expect commercial banks to come from across the world for these projects. European, Asian, Australian, and US banks are likely to be involved. As Craig said, there is this involvement by ECAs in the European projects, and it may be that there's an expectation that there will be ECAs, export credit agencies, involved on the US side as well, because they bring longer tenor, they provide lower rates, but there are some specific constraints that may apply that may not apply in Europe in the same way. EIB, for instance, has a specific mandate to grow renewables in Europe. And so the universe of ECAs that may be able and interested in participating in US offshore wind may be smaller than those in Europe, even if it's supported by procurement and the equity jurisdiction of sponsors.
Okay, so fair enough. Maybe at least in the early stages and for a variety of reasons that you've outlined, we may see fewer ECA and less ECA involvement. But let's assume let's look at the glass half full, Nosy, and let's say you've got a financing that has both a traditional U.S. project finance structure, wholly non-recourse, but you've got ECA involvement. So let's say you've got commercial banks, maybe another financing source, and then you've got export credit agencies. What are the challenges that people will see when they try to integrate ECA financing into a traditional U.S. project finance structure?
Chris, the glass half full approach means it's doable, but there are some challenges that have to be addressed up front. Two key ones are the fact that ECAs prefer longer term debt. Right? They look to go in and stay in the project for sort of a lot of the life of the underlying procurement contract for the project. The U.S. commercial banks, however, prefer the mini-perm structure, 7 to 8 year construction debt that is then refinanced and termed out. ECAs are in many cases uncomfortable with this refinancing risk. And so structural solutions can be developed, and we've been involved in developing some of them, to integrate ECA financing with mini-perm debt, but it can be complicated. Another factor that will be interesting to watch in this space is the fact that ECAs are not that familiar with tax equity structures, which are really a U.S. feature of the renewable energy space. And so they will have to come up the learning curve, understand how tax equity fits in, but also more importantly, the inter-creditor issues that may arise with a longer-term ECA debt and the tax equity will have to be worked out very carefully, because there will be significant challenges in marrying the ECA requirements with the tax equity requirements. Because of this and the fact that ECAs generally have a longer timeline, they have various administrative and process issues, it may be that the benefits of including ECAs are outweighed by the costs, especially as we continue in this low rate environment with very deep commercial bank appetite. Chris, just to mention, I think capital markets will be a significant source of this financing, as we've seen in other U.S. project developments, more likely as a refinancing source to construction debt. The 144A market and the U.S. private placement market have been very deep sources of refinancing at very attractive rates for many projects in recent years. Sponsors may also be participating in the financing either as pari passu senior debt or as corporate debt that is then funneled down as equity or tax equity. And there may be supplier financing from the suppliers of the equipment that's used in these projects. Finally, as you mentioned, Chris, we're waiting to see what comes out of the full-blown Biden administration energy policy, and whether there are significant federal financing support structures that are in addition to tax credits that may be available.
Okay, great. That's certainly true. It reminds me, and Nosy, I said we weren't going to try to make a lot of predictions. I mean, obviously, one prediction would be that there will be a strong initiative, given where the Senate ended up, for renewables. But for many years now, there's been a real focus by organizations, and we'll talk a bit about this, to drive toward renewable and sustainable energy sources in the U.S. despite the availability of low-cost carbon alternatives and the relative absence of strong incentives apart from the tax incentives that we'll talk about. I do want to just, speaking of tax, mention that our tax group led a very interesting, detailed discussion of potential Biden tax incentives. Sorry, not tax incentives, tax policy changes. So those of you who are U.S. taxpayers may want to sit up and take notice a bit. It was an interesting discussion. It was recorded. It's available on the S&C website. If you have trouble finding it, you can let us know, and we'll send it to you. But it was a very interesting, and much of it is predictive. But that just as a little detail here, many of those changes that are important to you personally, individually as a U.S. taxpayer, will not largely come into effect until 2022 as a prediction, except possibly for capital gains tax changes. And the other bit of news, but a prediction, is that despite Senate being in control of Democratic hands by a slim majority, SALT is never coming back fully. The state and local income tax deduction. So that's a little bit of advertising for our other session. So let's turn to the equity piece now. Sam, and also programming note for people. Yes, the map has gone away, and yes, that's intentional. So now you're just looking at us, and sorry about that. So Sam, can you give us a quick summary of what we've seen in terms of equity in Europe?
Yeah, sure, Chris. It's been mostly dominated by large utilities and large energy companies, the likes of RWE, EDF, SSE, EDP on the utility side, and on the energy side, certainly, obviously, Ørsted, Equinor, Eni, Total, others coming in. But there have been a number of exceptions that funds and financial investors that have been in from the start of a project. And certainly, we've seen a number of examples of the large sponsors divesting minority stakes pre-completion. One example of that is Ørsted, which has used a construction wrap model to bring in pension funds where those funds don't have to take completion risk. Chris, I think you were involved in another one of those, Maple Power.
Yeah, I was going to mention, Sam, the other good example is Maple Power, which it's based in the UK. It's a joint venture between Enbridge and CPPIB, thanks to a transaction that involved Enbridge disposing of 49% stake in its renewables platform in North America and in Europe a few years ago. And as part of that transaction, the two parties, Enbridge and CPPIB, developed Maple Power, and it originates, develops, and manages offshore wind projects in Europe. The current Maple Power projects, which are on its website, include two large wind projects offshore Germany with the EnBW, and three large wind projects offshore France with EDF. So those are interesting examples, right, where you're bringing in a pension fund willing to take greenfield development risk and willing to assume completion risk in connection with projects that Enbridge has been developing in conjunction with its own partners, and it will continue to look for other opportunities. So that's an interesting platform that we've seen developing.
Yeah, and I think we could see more of that for sure, especially given the push for ESG-focused investments by a lot of the big funds, really mandates to make that happen. So they're very hungry for renewable assets. I think also the other trend to watch is just given the public statements of all of the big energy companies about how they're going to be out there bidding in all of these rounds and really hungry for offshore assets. That's going to be continued to be dominated by those. Conversely, some of the smaller players, smaller infrastructure funds, private equity, we just haven't seen as much interest given, I think, the large equity checks and just the very competitive pricing.
Right. Thanks, Sam. So Inosi, let's flip back to the U.S. Where do you see, what have you seen so far on equity sources in U.S. projects?
Here we see strong similarities with Europe, right? In contrast to onshore wind in the U.S., where there are smaller developers, offshore wind has these really large developers, like Sam has mentioned, in Europe. The utilities, strategic renewable companies, diversifying oil and gas companies, Ørsted, Avangrid, as you mentioned earlier, Chris, Eversource, Equinor, BP Shell. It's a list of very strong, experienced developers, which is a great endorsement to U.S. offshore wind. And it also shows that there's going to be extensive experience and balance sheets that are standing behind the development of this growing new sector in the U.S. that is likely going to be a significant mitigant for lenders and rating agencies who are looking at the potential risks that arise in this new sector, particularly on the construction side and technology risk, where there's such a quick changing and growing developments that are happening very rapidly. This is sort of a contrast to the initial LNG export projects. I mentioned that, that's a comparison. Here, this is actually a distinctive factor because when the U.S. LNG export project started, the developers in the U.S. Had much less experience developing and operating, and significant time and effort was spent getting lending sources comfortable with their experience to do this. Now, of course, they have done that very successfully, but that issue is sort of taken off the table in the offshore wind space. This is likely to be very attractive to other types of investors as well. We heard from BP in investing in the 50% equity in the Equinor Empire Wind project. They're very focused on the attractive pricing in the U.S. market with the long-term offtake contracts, the fact that this is the fastest growing sector in the energy value chain. And so these downward cost pressures that we're continually seeing and the market trends towards diversifying energy portfolios with clean energy are likely to mean this is very attractive to a whole range of equity sources.
Okay, so Inosi, then what about, you talked about strategics. What about private equity infrastructure funds and then longer term investors like sovereign wealth funds and pension funds that are active in the infrastructure space?
Yes, Chris. I think in infrastructure funds, long-term pension investors are likely to be a key source. We've seen them actually currently upfront in the greenfield space, such as Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners in Vineyard Wind and looking at other U.S. projects. So we expect them to be a source, especially as the sector grows over time and there's brownfield development and more investment in them. They're likely to be a core source of equity. Private equity is also likely to be keen on this space. Apollo in August 2020 invested in convertible debt in U.S. wind in Maryland. So they're clearly getting involved at early stages, but they're also likely to be a big source in the brownfield stage as well. Here there are similarities to U.S. LNG export projects. We saw private equity firms such as Blackstone come in very early to provide equity for the Cheniere Sabine Pass project, which they recently sold out at the operational phase, but we're likely to see similar trends in the offshore wind sector.
Okay, so let me just program note here. People will see that we're going on to, we got about 18 minutes before our scheduled stop time. I think we will continue beyond that for those who are interested and have time. But then subsequently we will send all those materials that we've talked about and answer some questions that we were not able to cover. So let me turn back to tax equity, which we've mentioned a little bit, the elephant in the room on renewables projects in the U.S. because it is so different from the U.S. And I recognize there are a large number of people on this watching us now, some of whom have a lot of experience in tax equity and some of whom have relatively little, who may be European or other non-U.S. investors who are looking at the U.S. market. Let me turn to Tia to tell us a little bit more about what the tax equity is and how that fits into certainly how it's traditionally fit into independent power projects in the renewable space in the U.S. and how it's going to unfold in offshore wind.
Thank you, Chris. Tax equity refers to a cash investment in a renewable energy project in which the investor receives a significant portion of its return in the form of tax attributes rather than cash distributions. These attributes include traditional tax attributes such as depreciation, but what's of interest here are the tax credits specifically created under the Internal Revenue Code for the purpose of incentivizing investment in renewable energy projects. Tax credits come in two flavors: the investment tax credit, or the ITC, and the production tax credit, or the PTC. The investor uses these tax credits and other tax deductions, such as depreciation, to offset the investor's other income tax liability. Tax credits are especially valuable because they reduce tax liability on a dollar-for-dollar basis. The ITC is calculated based on eligible project costs. It is a specified percentage of the costs of developing and constructing a project. The ITC vests over 5 years, but the entirety of the ITC may be taken in the first year a project is placed in service, and that occurs at or close to the time a project is placed into commercial operation, but not afterwards. So the investment needs to occur prior to the time the project is placed into commercial operation. The PTC is an annual credit that is based upon the actual amount of electricity produced in a given calendar year, and it is available in each of the first 10 years of a project's commercial operation. Historically, solar projects have taken advantage of the ITC and wind projects have taken advantage of the PTC. But until the recent spending legislation that was enacted at the end of 2020, the PTC was scheduled to phase out and reduce in value over time. The headline good news for offshore wind projects is that the legislation adopted at the end of 2020 specifically enacted a 30% ITC for offshore wind. So offshore wind projects that began construction as of January 1, 2017, or commenced construction prior to December 31, 2025, are eligible for a 30% ITC. 30% of the entire eligible cost of developing and constructing these projects. And this is going to be very good news for sponsors and developers who want to obtain capital from investors who are going to be looking for tax relief as they invest in an emerging industry that will burnish their green credentials.
Okay, so that's interesting, Tia. But if you think back to the IPP, the development of IPPs and the role that tax equity played there, those were much smaller projects. These are, as we said, huge development projects with huge capital costs. Do we really think there's going to be enough capacity in the tax equity market to provide that piece? Because it's not just a sliver, right? 30% is a big chunk. You got, if it's 50, 30, 20 in the capital stack, 50% debt, 30% tax equity, and 20% equity. Is there enough out there to fill that slug of the capital stack from tax equity?
Well, that is a great question, because the numbers here we're talking about are gargantuan. In part, it depends upon future tax policy, in that when tax liability rises, the interest in tax efficiency increases. Among the Biden administration's tax proposals, as discussed by our tax team in their seminar, are potential increases in corporate taxes, including a minimum corporate tax based upon book income. This is something new and would increase tax liability for all of our US corporations. And it could catalyze interest in tax equity from new sources that have historically not looked at the renewable energy market. This could include a number of corporate entities that have been sourcing their electricity needs under corporate PPAs from renewable sources as well. They can be both off-takers as well as tax equity investors. But I would also not underestimate the desire on the part of the existing tax equity investors from the financial community to participate in green investments in offshore wind. Almost all of them have in place policies to encourage investment in green energy, in sustainability, investments in the new economy, and quite a number of them are shunning investments in industries, such as coal and fossil fuels. They need some place to make their investments. So I would expect the largest financial institutions, tax equity investors, entities like JP Morgan, for example, to be actively engaged in looking at these projects. I also think large energy companies and utility affiliates, the companies mentioned by Inosi and Sam, are potential tax equity investors as well as traditional sponsors and equity investors, because the roles are not mutually exclusive.
Okay, thank you. That's a good answer to my question. Inosi, earlier I asked you about integrating ECAs into a traditional U.S. project finance structure. Let's ask the same question with regard to integrating tax equity into a project financing. Can you expand? You mentioned the challenges there earlier, but can you expand on that?
Sure, Chris. As Tia mentioned, tax equity is funded closer to the commercial operations debt. So you have construction financing coming in up front, spending a lot of their funding to develop the project, and a portion of that being taken out by tax equity as the project gets to the operational phase. Now, those construction lenders and financiers will be very interested in ensuring that the tax equity is lined up and there to repay them at the appropriate time. Sponsors will also be interested in ensuring that the tax equity investment is available to ensure the overall projected returns. As a result of this, there's likely going to be a very strong push to get the tax equity commitments locked in upfront when the construction debt is locked in. Now, obviously, there will be some challenges to this versus the cost. They will likely require some fee to do that. And it may mean there is a smaller universe of tax equity providers that is willing to lock in commitments for that time period, which could be up to 2 years. So, layering in the concerns that were discussed just previously by you, Chris, and Tia, looking at that universe to see how many of those will be willing to do that will be something that developers should focus on early in the project process and developing the finance plan. One key advantage, however, to locking in tax equity upfront is that the tricky forbearance, sometimes called inter-creditor issues, that come up between tax equity and debt can be addressed early in the process.
So, and by the way, we're getting a lot of interesting questions. They're very good questions, and I hope we have a chance to address some of them. But again, we're going to address a number of them. I'm glad people are so engaged in this. So let me just ask you, Inosi, it's more complex even than what you've just said, right? Because there can also be debt up the corporate ownership chain, right? Because depending on the capital needs of an equity investor, they may be incurring debt up the corporate ownership chain. How should we be thinking about inter-creditor issues there?
Chris, you're right. It is more complicated than that. There's so much capital that's required here. There's likely to be multiple sources of capital just at the project level. We discussed the ECAs and commercial banks. And then there's likely to be capital up that corporate chain to fund some of the equity coming in or as back leverage to take out some portion of the construction financing. Each of these may impact the tax equity terms and their ability to get the benefits of the tax credits that Tia mentioned, because actions they could take could impact those tax credits. And so there will be complicated inter-creditor issues that have to be addressed at various levels and tiers of the corporate chain that could be quite fraught if those are left to be addressed post-closing, when initial terms have been agreed. And so it will be really important for developers to engage with their financial advisors and legal advisors to work these issues out early in the process.
That's right, Inosi. Strictly speaking, we shouldn't refer to these arrangements as inter-creditor agreements because tax equity isn't a creditor. Treating tax equity as debt can create problems with the tax treatment being sought. From a tax equity point of view, there's a tension between the exercise of certain remedies by the lenders and what tax equity needs in order to ensure that they are able to claim and utilize the tax credits. And remember, the tax credits is what they are seeking as a commercial matter. It's the benefit of the bargain that they are entering into, in consideration for their 30% of the cost of constructing this project. So think about it this way. Tax equity is only going to fund at the end of the construction period and only if there are assurances, typically in the form of representations in the equity contribution agreement, that the project will qualify for tax credits. These representations are supported by diligence and indemnities from creditworthy entities amongst the sponsor group. Sometimes these indemnities are supported by collateral security, and this can set up obvious conflicts with lenders who have similar collateral security. After funding, tax equity is going to seek covenants and restrictions on the part of the project, on the part of the lenders and their exercise of remedies to prevent any person from taking actions that could trigger recapture of tax credits. Technical term of art amongst tax practitioners, but here's what it means. As I mentioned earlier, the ITC vests over 5 years, but certain actions can trigger recapture or loss of tax credits in subsequent years. And typical lender remedies that lenders would consider normal or even sacrosanct can trigger recapture. For example, a sale or disposition of the underlying project assets or a change of control. Even an upstream change of control, if the subsequent owner is a disqualified person, and I put that in quotes because you have to speak to a tax lawyer to understand exactly what a disqualified person might be in this context, can trigger a loss of the tax credits. And if that happens, the tax equity investor would no longer be entitled to the tax credits and would thereby lose the entire benefit of the bargain they struck when they made their upfront investment. And so for that reason, the tax equity will often seek in their forbearance agreement or their inter-party agreement or whatever we call it, as long as it isn't called an inter-creditor agreement, tax equity will seek cure rights. They will seek lender forbearance. They will seek a whole host of other remedies and other arrangements to make sure that they are getting the benefit of their bargain under certain circumstances. And so I would just say that these are highly complicated and bespoke arrangements.
Okay, so I'm gonna, this is our moderator's prerogative here. I recognize we've got 4 minutes left of the schedule amount. We still have basically everybody that joined us at the outset still with us. And I want to just tell you what we can cover, or what we would be covering, and what is in the deck that you'll get. And those are offtake issues, which can be of course, those are critical from a credit point of view. Transmission, which is an interesting topic in the U.S. And I think we might want to spend a couple of minutes on that if we could. And then other kind of financing risks, concerns to lenders, technology, construction, completion risk, and we were going to talk about process management. But we've also had some very good questions. I'm going to just mention to you, Sam, I'd like to cover green bonds, since you and a number of us have been across those, and it was just interesting to talk about a prediction of how those will be important. I'm active in the sovereign finance space, and we've even had sovereigns doing green bonds. Mexico did a green bond offering in euro denominated that was highly successful last year. So if you could think about that, but let's just turn for a second, and maybe Tia, if you could talk a little bit about transmission before we really start to lose people, and then we'll address some of the questions that have been raised. Go ahead, Tia.
Sure. Transmission has always been a sticking point in the US and not just in the context of offshore wind. The lack of federal state coordination, the complexity of regional planning, NIMBYism, and the politics associated with the transition from fossil fuels to green energy have all contributed to patchwork solutions, or I would rather say non-solutions, in the context of offshore wind. As a result, the current projects that are under development, those that either have long-term PPAs or that have offshore renewable energy credit procurement contracts or contracts with state agencies, contemplate the construction of individual dedicated undersea transmission cables that will interconnect with the grid at specific points. Each project must make its own interconnection arrangements with onshore transmission owners and participate in the planning processes of the regional ISOs or RTOs. Independent system operators or regional transmission organizations authorized by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for those of you in Europe who may not be familiar with the patchwork nature of transmission in the United States. But it's a free-for-all, as the acronyms suggest, and creates tensions between competing projects, onshore generation projects, transmission upgrades, each of which is their own separate individual project competing for transmission access. In addition, the current processes do not account for the way the grid was originally constructed along the Atlantic seaboard. If you just look at geography, the way the grid was constructed contemplated power flows from north to south and from west to east. So there are going to need to be quite a number of tweaks in order to accommodate the entire concept of power flowing from offshore to onshore. And this is going to take a lot of engineering cooperation. It's going to take upgrades. It's not as simple as simply plugging the project into the grid and letting everything go forward. There are some people who are advocating the development and operation of an independent, coordinated, single offshore grid to accommodate all projects and work forward on that basis. And it's an idea that I think is worthy of consideration. I think it's going to require a concerted federal initiative, and maybe we'll get it in the years to come. I would say it's not a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. Both Republicans and Democrats have tried to deal with transmission over the last 30 years. It's not easy. We shall see.
That's helpful. All right, so we're over our time, but we still have a large number of people with us. So I'm going to do a couple of things, then I'll ask my fellow my colleagues if they have any burning desire to talk about any remaining issue. We've had a large number of questions. Here's what, because some of the questions are about process, right? So what we will do is send to each of you the full deck. You've only seen a couple of slides today, but there'll be a full deck that I think will be very useful in the future. There will also be specific answers to all the questions that have been asked. Some of the questions are very specific, others are a little more general, and I've kind of picked out. I highlighted green bonds. Sam, you and I can talk about it. But another I want to talk about, which I think people will be interested in, is the regulatory approvals that are required for an existing project. What kinds of regulatory approvals should be on the tick list of somebody who is looking to develop a project? Tia, you want to take that one?
On regulatory?
Yes.
Sure. Something that's important to keep in mind for those less familiar with U.S. projects is the fact that multiple government agencies, regulators, and other entities, federal, state, regional, and local, all have oversight over U.S. offshore wind projects. Consequently, it's important to have a plan for the development and construction of the project developed in coordination with council and other experts across the board. The most important threshold approvals and permits incident to the development are the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM ocean leases, and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, clearance of the Construction and Operations Plan, or COP. The BOEM ocean lease is the permit that allows a sponsor to utilize a specific area of the ocean for the installation of the turbines. The COP must satisfy detailed environmental and safety standards. And these are the subject of review and oversight. And yes, because we're in the United States, a lot of litigation. The process can take a significant amount of time. So it's going to be prudent for a sponsor to take a long-term view of how this project may evolve over time, and proactively consider how best to achieve the phasing of the project and potential expansions of the project if these are relevant. And bear in mind, if you consider bringing in future investors, or if you're contemplating disposing of the project at some point in the future, the BOEM leases are only assignable with the approval of BOEM. It's complicated. To be fair, the perception of regulatory risk associated with BOEM leases is partially based on the fact that we do not have as much experience with BOEM leases for offshore wind as we do for other types of permits for other projects. With experience, we will better understand the types of permits and the types of risks that are going to arise in this situation. And we're going to be developing protocols for managing and addressing regulatory risk. For these first projects, we're all going to need to get comfortable with the risk of cancellation, the risk of termination, and these are primarily around environmental and safety compliance.
Okay, so let me just.
Tia, just to add, that's a great point. I just wanted to add that a lot of these same issues came up in the early stages of U.S. LNG export development in the U.S. because the DOE export permit raised a lot of the same issues. There were concerns about, when it gets issued, rehearing risks, approvals of assignments and change of controls, as we've heard from Tia with the BOEM, and revocability, right? Under what circumstances could it be revocable? And a lot of time and effort was spent analyzing this from a developer perspective, but also getting the lenders, U.S. lenders, international lenders comfortable with this risk. Ultimately, the market did get comfortable, but sponsors should not take for granted the need to proactively address the issues up front.
Exactly, Anosi. These are all very high-profile projects. They are attracting a great deal of attention from the general public. And while the general view is that renewable energy is a good thing, there are many people who will nonetheless raise objections to specific projects. Whether it's fishermen who feel that their livelihoods are imperiled, or homeowners who feel that their ocean view is imperiled. Everyone loves green energy, but may raise objections to specific projects. And so I repeat again that it's not just about raising capital. It's about raising awareness and developing the project and reaching out to local constituencies in a way that ensures acceptance of the project.
So let me just ask a further question relating to approvals. Let's say there's an existing asset, and a developer wants to sell an interest in that to someone, and let's say it's a controlling stake. What are the regulatory approvals that, let's say I'm a pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund or just a non-U.S. company in the space, to make an investment in a U.S. project? Obviously, again, remembering it's a federal system. Tia, can you take that?
Sure, Chris. I mean, you would look at it the same way you would look at the acquisition of any other energy or utility project in the United States. And so you would need your typical antitrust approvals. You would need your typical energy approvals. That would, that could mean, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approval. It could mean state Public Utility Commission approval. It will mean BOEM approval and other um, approvals associated with the permits. And if you're a non-U.S. person, you may also need CFIUS clearance, and perhaps you want to address that because you're co-head of our CFIUS practice, and you've got experience there.
Okay, well, thank you. So yes, one of the reasons I'm in that role is that the firm recognized that as CFIUS was really honing in on the risks to the U.S. of non-U.S. investment, it became clear that infrastructure broadly defined, and if you think about the way infrastructure investing is moving and the way people think about infrastructure, particularly in 2021, is that it's not really about concrete, it's about technology. It's and energy and offshore wind farms and which connect to the grid are a good example of that. And those of you who have followed the developments in the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States know that there's now a mandatory regime for certain types of sensitive assets, and that does potentially include certain assets in this space. And it also is important to recognize that there's a really broad definition or lack of definition of what a controlling stake may mean when you have a foreign person making an investment in either an existing or a project under development in the offshore wind space. And anything that connects to the grid, anything that gives a non-U.S. person, particularly those not in the the kind of accepted areas such as Canada, the UK, Australia. It's very important that a non-U.S. investor put this on their list, both to do due diligence with regard to the target, and then if you look at it the other way around, a target selling to a range of investors wants to think about what the CFIUS risk is there, because it's not always just on the buyer, particularly if there's a mandatory arrangement. So that's probably all we have time for on CFIUS, but it's very important that issue be focused on. Sam is showing some online resources. The good news is this will be in the deck that you get from us, and we will add to it. I would ask my practice development team to do this. We will add to it a link to the tax seminar, since tomorrow is tax day for those of you who make estimated tax payments in the U.S. It's probably top of mind. Let me, Sam, you want to just address for a second what we've seen in the green finance space, green and sustainable finance, and then we'll close it out.
Sure, Chris, happy to. And I guess just on the last point on CFIUS as well, people in Europe will be familiar with new regimes that are going in effect in the UK and in France and Germany. And so there's analogous things that you need to think about when you're doing deals in those jurisdictions.
And I should say, this was not intended to be an advertisement, but we happen to have offices in Frankfurt, Paris, and London, and we do make filings across those areas, and it's a rapidly changing landscape. But go ahead, Sam, on green.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to speak all day about green finance, and certainly,
don't want you to do that.
But I won't do that. But we've seen it in the offshore wind space, certainly in Europe, and Taiwanese deals have been funded in part by green bonds, and I would fully expect people to try to label their bonds or their loans green loans under the LMA green loan principles. It's relatively straightforward if we're talking about a single asset financing, and that's just an added credential that you can have. That it won't it should not affect pricing really either way, better or worse at this stage. But we'll see, because there's going to be a lot of money raised, and it could actually kind of move the market and really help bolster the green finance market.
Okay, thank you. So look, we still have almost everybody that joined us initially, which is thrilling, and I'm sorry to have taken so much of your time. We very much appreciate your being here with us. And those of you who asked, because there are a lot of questions that we were not able to address, we will cover those. So if you're waiting till the bitter end to get that question answered, I'm sorry, but it will be answered in writing. So it will survive this, and it may take us a few days, by the way, given the large number of questions. So don't expect this by the weekend for your weekend reading. I want to just thank all of the panelists, Anosi and Tia in the U.S. and Craig and Sam. We operate as an integrated team here at Sullivan and Cromwell. We're used to handling firsts, really complex projects. We love complexity, and we love to try to solve for complexity in a commercially reasonable way to get the deal done. And we love the opportunity to engage with each of you in the future on these kinds of questions. And we love to get one-off questions. If you're looking at an asset and you want a particular perspective and you want to ask us on a kind of no names basis, we're willing to answer those. We're also happy to be engaged for them also. But anyway, it's going to be a very interesting 2021. It's obviously proved to be an interesting first 14 days, but in this space in particular, in offshore wind, I think the coming year to 18 months will be really interesting, and we look forward to partnering with many of you on those efforts. So stay safe, be well, and let's all hope for a better, as somebody said, could we just start over and wish each other a Happy New Year on January 31, those of us in the US, but let's hope for a better 2021 than the prior year, and we thank you all for joining us.